And joining us now to debate the culture of cheap and free in Hong Kong via webcam, Matthew Sears, Business Development Manager at the Edge Learning Center. In Calgary, Alberta, Gordon Laird, author of The Price of a Bargain. And here in studio, Alan Middleton, Professor of Marketing at the Schulich School of Business. Mike DeBramo, Director of Research and Strategy at Youthography. And Jesse Brown, host of TVO's Search Engine. Good to have you all here, both in the studio and in points well beyond. Matthew, I think this is our first time coming out of Hong Kong, so thanks for making time for us. What time is it there, I should ask?
It's about 8:15 in the morning here, Steve.
Oh, terrific. So you got to sleep in a little bit. Well, if globalization is responsible for creating the conditions where cheap-priced goods are produced in the developing world, digital technology, as I don't have to tell Jesse, has created conditions which allow computer users to enjoy the fruits of other people's labors for free. We are going to talk free later. We are going to stick with cheap for now. Alan, to you first. Do you agree with Ellen Ruppel-Shell that cheap may be good for consumers, but in the long run, it's bad for society?
Absolutely not.
You don't?
No. 100% disagreement.
Why?
Number one, the research says that in any of the developed world, the number of people who are actually pure price seekers, only looking for price, is less than 10% of virtually any market. So consumers do traditionally look for value. Number two, I totally disagree with her concept which says cheap is against innovation. In fact, lowering the cost of most goods and services is a way to have manufacturers and marketers try to increase the innovation in order to deliver it. Now, let's deal with the globalization issue offshore. Number one, that tends to shift employment to other markets where they can do it better. But over time, with that 10% figure in there, they're not going to keep supplying if it's only cheap and not delivering the value. And my very last point is there's a concept in the way people buy. It's called the involvement concept. The more important things are to people, the more they're going to spend time looking and evaluating the quality versus the price.
So cars,
the less important, then yeah, I may do with some stuff for a little while and it doesn't really matter and I'll move on.
I want to find out from Jesse Brown. We're going to talk free later. Still on the issue of cheap, because you're all about the free. I know about that. Let's stick to cheap now. Do you contribute to the problem of cheap by looking for, in your own personal life, for example, bargain basement deals on whatever?
Oh, God, no.
No.
No, I buy, cheeses that have been washed in vegetable ash by French-Canadian monks, and I buy vintage 70s furniture.
No, you don't.
I do these things not because I'm morally superior, but because I'm a bit of a snob, and I have too much money to throw around just because I don't have kids or anything like that. There's this vicious sophistry that has allowed people who are indulging themselves with organic meat and local produced vegetables, which are not all that ecologically sound to produce, that allows people who, and it's fine, we buy these things because we like them, because they give us pleasure, because they're aesthetically nice or they taste better. I agree with all of that, but it doesn't make me a better person than the guy who's buying ground beef and a big piece of cheddar cheese from a Costco to feed 4 kids.
Do you look down at that person who's going to Walmart or Costco or something to get that super bargain basement deal?
Of course I don't. I think that the impulse that has allowed people who are making these top shelf purchases to not feel like something, to feel that there's something actually virtuous in eating caviar as opposed to Spam, there's something wrong there. And I think it does come out of a certain type of class disgust. It's not that, we're not comfortable with saying, oh, that grosses me out. The way that person eats is gross to me. So instead we say, the way that that person behaves morally is gross to me. They're contributing to a system that is horribly immoral, and that's messed up, because not everybody has the luxury of making those top shelf purchases.
Matthew, you live in Hong Kong, and I wonder if people there in that part of the world are as hot for the bargain basement sale, rather, as we apparently are in North America.
I think definitely. I mean, we've had a culture of cheap and pirated long before the internet and long before broadband opened the floodgates in North America to these things. So, we're much more familiar with cheap and again, with pirated goods here. So, yes, you have the bargain hunters, but you also have, the highest number of Rolls Royces and Mercedes per capita. So there are other factors besides price affecting people's purchases.
Mike, you spend your time researching consumer behavior for the young. Are they as eager to find those sales as apparently their parents are?
Well, you'll find that young people always describe themselves as pragmatic. They're looking for value, generally speaking. And it's an interesting sort of trend because their definition of value might be very different than what their family's definition of value. They'll buy Jesse's organic meats because they think it's better for them. Whether it's true or not is irrelevant. They just believe that's a better ecological footprint, or they think it's healthier or better tasting. On the other hand, if you look at our research at Youthography and what we put out, we have surveys where we'll ask young people, where do you shop most frequently? Number one on the list is still stores like Zellers and Walmart. On the other hand, though, the percentage of people who shop at thrift stores, secondhand, DIY type fashion is going up. So you are losing some of them at that cheap top end, but you are seeing some, for lack of a better word, innovation or creativity or, reuse and recycling of fashion at the bottom end. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics with the youth, with young Canadians. It's kind of an unusual circumstance. They're a little bit ahead of the curve and a little behind the curve in other ways.
Jesse, you're a youth. I cannot imagine you going to Zellers or Walmart.
Barely a youth. As for Zellers and Walmart, not so much, no. I'll say one thing that came to mind, though, listening about the book. The cheapening of technological goods, of cell phones, of laptops, and we contextualize that with what is doing social good in the world. The proliferation of those phones, they've gotten so cheap that they're in Africa, they bought 8 million cell phones last year. China has had a huge boom. Nothing has as much promise of bridging the divide between the third world and the first world than the distribution of really cheap, breakable, not the ones we don't want anymore. That's what's going to bring those people up to speed, and this is doing a tremendous amount of good.
Gordon, all right, go ahead.
I found her comments very American. I don't think, and the research says, it doesn't apply so much to Canada. It certainly doesn't apply so much to Europe. Our friend in Hong Kong was making the comment about the top and the bottom end. So US is a very price-driven market, more price than most places in the world. But I don't think you can generalize that to the rest of the world and all consumers.
Let me get Gordon Laird into this, because Gordon, you've got your own book coming out next month on this same subject, The Price of a Bargain, which we should stress is not a book on how to hunt for bargains. Here is, in fact, a very stark quote from your book. Let's put this up now, Michael, if we can. Iqaluit, you tell us, Iqaluit is on the cutting edge of many of our most important 21st century challenges. This is a land that is beyond cheap, a place that Walmart and all other major retailers have forsaken, a place where people are too often forced to pay the true price of things. Just explain what you mean by that, the true price of things representing what?
Well, up in Iqaluit, for example, a lot of the embodied cost of things is transport, which, as many of us know, is essentially a form of energy cost. And so one of the things that we're looking at in the 21st century, and I will say that I take some objection to sort of framing cheap as simply a cultural development, because what we're looking at is a system, a fairly advanced and innovative system, but a system with a lot of chaos, a lot of value destruction. So something like in Iqaluit where there's not a lot of income growth. There's a lot of embodied energy cost. There's things like climate change causing a little additional disruption. That's, in a sense, part of our picture for the 21st century. So where I live here in Alberta, for example, we have this thing called the tar sands, which is essentially about trying to turn dirt into so-called affordable energy. And there's a whole host of problems with trying to sustain what was a fairly innovative sort of development of globalization that turned into a quest for cheap. We continue that on in the 21st century, and we're fraught with many complications. So energy being one, maxed out consumer liquidity being other. The fact that we're actually been funding new superpowers to usurp our position in the world. I'm speaking of China specifically. So there's all these other factors that are sort of not quite in the frame, and I find it interesting with Shell's point of view in the States is that I wish it were simply a question of consumer choice and consumer values, because that would be the simple answer. These other factors are actually, to me, far more foreboding.
Matthew, do you want to follow up on that? China was mentioned there. You're right next door.
I mean, it depends how broadly you want to expand the scope of the argument. I don't think that cheap is, you said the true cost of things. If you're counting transport costs, then perhaps the efficiencies brought by things like Walmart and their distribution network have lowered the true cost of those goods. Transporting it up to northern Canada obviously carries with a greater cost. I don't think that's necessarily empowering China as a superpower to overtake us, as you say.
Oh, no, I meant by way of balance of trade, by way of, say, providing dispossessed rural farmers, migrant labour with jobs. I mean, China essentially funded much of its development with export trade in the first, in the last 40 years. So, I mean, who's been buying that stuff? Well, we have. It's a fairly historic development. I don't think China is necessarily going to want that role in the future necessarily. I think intra-Asian trade is very much a happening thing.
Matthew, you want to come back on that?
Definitely, I think, but I mean, you have to ask, what would these rural farmers be doing otherwise? I mean, they're exporting cheap goods that have a market in parts of the world that are very price sensitive, and yes, I think that the quality of goods that China and other countries export continues to rise, but somebody's got to feed this hunger for cheap products in North America.
That's where Alan Middleton comes in. Go ahead.
I don't disagree with Gordon in terms of the cost, the footprint, the everything else in terms of water, land, air pollution. That to me is a different argument, because that's called, let's charge the realistic cost of that. That's different, because if the realistic cost goes in and the consumer's still looking for value, which is, I'm still saying is the majority motivation, then that is exactly the lead to innovation, to make sure that you're not abusing those resources, which we are now because they're underpricing, but you look for alternatives if the real cost comes in because of people searching to get better value.
What happens to this economy, though, if we start paying the full freight of what goods are really worth?
Overnight, you couldn't do it. What it is you have to evolve your way to it. So that's why you've got discussions about cap and trade systems and everything else, because it's not a way of avoiding the issue, although I could agree that it might be, but it is a way of evolving the process.
Gordon, you wanted to come in on that again?
Oh, I said if it happened overnight, we'd probably crash. I mean, we talk about tech bubbles, we talk about finance bubbles. Well, to some degree, we've been subsidized by globalization, and in ways that haven't been without benefit. Jesse mentioned the wave of technology. Certainly, the affordability for households is the affordability of products is a big concern. You take that away, and homelessness continues to rise. Foreclosures continue to rise. So we've been, in a sense, living in a prosperity bubble. This is not to suggest it would crash tomorrow, but the sort of the good times of the early 2000s and the 1990s, I don't think will be sustained quite as profoundly throughout the 21st century.
Mike, I got an email just before going on the air tonight from a loyal viewer named Scott McMeekin, who emails from time to time saying, make sure you ask someone about the impact of environmentalism on this. So that's my question for you. The young people that you study have been raised on an environmental consciousness in a way that those of us who are older were not. Does that make them more willing to accept that the age of cheap may be behind us?
Short answer is yes. The reality is when we do our research, we find that between 30 and 40% of young people are concerned about over-packaging, sustainable production of it, where was it from? In fact, even nationalism plays in. When we ask young people, we did a parallel survey in the US and Canada, and for real, we asked people if you had a choice of purchasing a product from your country, from another country, what would you choose? 32% of Canadian youth said they'd always prefer to choose from their own country. They thought that was an important factor. Only 16% of American youth were saying that. So there may be a bit of a cultural divide here. We have a saying about youth in Canada that they're proud to be it, hard to see it when it comes to being Canadian. Maybe that's a way it manifests itself. But yeah, in short, I still remember in school when we got recycle bins in our school. And then when my last career where I was a high school teacher, it was like kids would ask me, where is the recycle bin? It was like an expectation. And I think that's going to happen down the road. Eventually, this organic food and everything else that we talk about, the 100-mile diet and all that, that's not going to be weird anymore. That's not going to be the new thing. That's going to be normal.
Jesse, can I get you then on the whole environmental aspect of this, and whether we're potentially, your generation is more willing to accept that the age of cheap is behind us?
Well, I think in that respect, it's a factor that goes into purchases. But I think that, like anything else, it is subject to marketing and it can be gamed. And I think you'll find that some of the same people who would answer a survey that that's a factor that goes into their purchases are the same people who are throwing water bottles, plastic water bottles, when there's a perfectly good tap water system in Toronto. It comes from the same feeling of suspicion of the quality of water and pollution and whatnot. And those people are producing an incredible amount of waste out of their consciousness of ecological issues.
Matthew, how about environmentalism over there? Most of what we hear about the environment in China is that they're putting up a new coal-fired generating station every week there. Environment doesn't seem to be as quite a part of the consciousness in China as it is over here. What do you say?
No, I think like most developing countries, the emphasis is first on getting developed at any cost. But I think, like everybody else is saying, it's just a question of what factors beyond price are influencing our decisions. I mean, young people are always attacked for going after the cheapest and the freest first. But just like everybody else, we have perceptions of what quality is, and those all weigh in. Quality, and that goes for everything from clothing that's to organic food to free media online.
Alan.
In China and India, which I visit a lot, you've always got this balancing act between driving employment and driving GDP growth through the development systems which suck up energy and everything else. But in both those countries, you have environmental issues as a high priority, not because they think they should, but because they have to. Any of you who spent any time in Beijing, in most of the time when the red dust storm is there and you can't see your hand in front of the face, know why it's a priority with the Chinese government.
Gordon, can I hear you on this? You talked actually a few moments ago about the tar sands, which I thought in Alberta you're not allowed to use that expression anymore. I thought we have to call it the oil sands now because it sounds more benign, but let me get you on that.
Well, I don't see police in the studio here yet to nab me, luckily. Well, certainly, I mean, it's, you know, the thing about the grand system of cheap, if I may call it that, is that it's very much so insulated, most of us, from consequences, from externalities, from additional costs, and done so not necessarily by design, but often by ingenuity, by linkages, by interdependence. I was watching the Dalai Lama earlier today, and he spoke of the global economy, deeply interdependent in his, you know, in the way that he says these things. So I mean, you know, I think it's no coincidence that you know, Chinese state oil companies spending billions now investing in the oil sands of Canada. Partly because I think Canada is a laggard in introducing carbon costs into its framework. In a sense, Canada is becoming a very sort of developing country in its attitudes, as we're associating our plenitude and our growth with trying to sidestep costs of trying to provide cheap energy. So the parallel between China and Canada is very fascinating. In China, there's huge protests about pollution, and as Matthew rightly said, I mean, the action there is because it's getting in the way of health and in the way of business, and certainly in the way of political stability. So that isn't quite the case here in Canada. So it's in many ways, China is moving faster than Canada on some of its environmental initiatives.
Mike, I wonder if you have any data which show, even though this generation, this new generation, has been raised with an environmental consciousness that previous generations didn't have, they'd still rather pay 50 cents a liter for their gasoline anyway, incidentally.
Well, everyone's going to want the race to the lowest price. There's no doubt about it. And I mean, this generation, as we're going to talk about in a second on the show, the race to free, the idea of downloading stuff for free and other things that go with it. But there's a weird thing that happens with this generation, I think, that there's certain things that quality matters about. Yeah, I can download a TV show illegally and watch it one time, but if I really like a show or a movie, I may still go out and buy the Criterion collection of my favorite director's film. So sometimes quality matters, sometimes it doesn't. I think it really is subjective according to people. I think the real problem is, and this is the question I always have in my mind, are we devaluing everything by making it so cheap? If we devalue what the artist creates or what the person who makes clothing, if we rate it at a lower price, are we saying that it's worth less, and therefore we're changing our attitudes about it? It's a really interesting question, because eventually, like, these kids are going to be running these companies. They're going to be running the country. What are they going to be doing, and how are they going to think of these things?
Alan and then Matthew.
I kind of amused by the whole conversation about cheap, because there's one coffee retailer who's just introduced instant coffee. And the criticism of Starbucks was how much they were ripping people off with a high price. Now we're having a discussion about what's the problem with cheap when Starbucks is trying to reduce price. They're introducing instant coffee to lower the overall price perception. Nintendo's just reduced the cost on Wii. Sony's just again reduced the cost on PlayStation. And I think we're confusing two things. I think we're confusing cheap to adjustments in what people see as value in the market. And reducing a price does not make Starbucks cheap to go in, but it certainly brings it in better value, which is very much in keeping with the current economic climate.
Matthew and then Mike again.
Well, I think going back to Gordon's point, one of the advantages we have in Asia and in China in particular is the flexibility. I mean, when it comes to environmentalism and things like that, we don't have generations of entrenched interests. Everything here is happening almost for the first time. So you can move faster. Of course, part of that is political. but there's no status quo to overcome, and that has a huge bearing on the ability of the government and the consumer population to make a change, both in environmental policy and in content ownership laws and everything.
Mike.
I often wonder, when we apply this kind of question to fashion, how many times can you go to an H&M and buy the next new thing, and then 2 weeks later decide you need to go and get the next new thing?
Well, apparently, according to our previous guest, every 5.5 days.
Well,
Americans
yeah, and
purchase a new piece
I
of
kind of
clothing.
wonder, I always wonder when I see the numbers that say that people like to shop at, they shop at Walmart, because they also shop at the mall and the H&M and the Gap and all those other stores, very popular, and then the thrift stores show up, and I often wonder, are they just buying so much stuff at those high-end stores to turn them in 6 weeks later and hand it in at a thrift store and trade it in by the pound for something else? I don't think that's what's actually happening, but I guess I wonder, if we make things so inexpensive, are we just encouraging disposability rather than a sense of checking whether or not the garment's made well, checking whether or not it's going to last more than just 3 weeks or 6 weeks or however long that season's fashion matters?
All of these comments, I think, lead us nicely into a segue from cheap to free. The Great Recession has given rise to much talk about the need for thrift, while the internet speaks, Jesse, of course, about the language of free. Just before we talk about this, our packaging director, David Irwin, put a little piece of tape together here about internet-bred consumer habits. Roll tape.
I mostly download movies,
I'll download video games,
music,
a lot of literature,
taped lectures,
pieces of software.
TV shows.
I've avoided large textbook fees for my classes by downloading portions of the readings that I get assigned at school.
I can find literally anything I'm looking for. There's no limit to what's out there.
The last time I was in a video store would have been easily 2 years ago.
I am not sure when the last time I went to see a movie in the theater was.
The first and only CD I ever bought was a classical cover, or a series of classical covers of Pink Floyd songs, and that was in grade 7.
Good choice, you say, Alan. Yeah, good choice, but okay. Now, these are, Matthew, you couldn't see this because you're in Hong Kong, but basically you got two guys here whose faces were obscured so that they were revealing their freeloading habits incognito, but you are basically saying the same thing and you are signing your name to it. So let me just ask you directly, are you a freeloader?
Well, it's a good question. I think yes, and to a certain extent, just like those guys with the blurred out faces. But it's not purely free. The calculus, again, isn't purely what's free. It's that in the realm of music and movies and TV shows, what's the best product? And like the discussion was going before, there's a number of different factors in that. But for a long time, and still today, you could argue, the best product available online is provided by pirates. iTunes can't compete. The legal movie stores, the legal song downloading packages can't compete on a number of other factors, let alone price. So of course we're choosing the illegal option.
Jesse, is there perversity about that?
Absolutely not. That's a fantastic point. The fact of the matter is we've been having this debate for the past 10 years or so. Is it right? Is it wrong? Are they pirates? Are they getting just revenge against an industry that's been ripping them off? And I'll sign my name to it too. I've done my fair share, whether it's fair or not. The fact of the matter is we've been dealing for the past 10 years with an environment where what you get by taking it without paying is more convenient and higher quality and more immediate than what you would get if you paid for it. And as long as that's the equation, if you're getting less for actually going about the proper way, it just is. And the fact of the matter is, this is a disruptive technology, for good or for ill. It's created a better way. It's a better way of getting music. It's a better way of getting movies. The idea that I should have to go to a rental store and rent the DVD, spend a half hour there physically going through the shelves, take it home, have to bring it back afterwards, there's just no need. We fixed that problem. And the industry, because they have been clinging so desperately to these outmoded business models and not adapting and not getting with it, I think the movie industry is going to suffer the same fate as the music industry.
Alan's now going to tell us how often he has illegally downloaded something by Pink Floyd.
Quite often, actually.
Do you?
But I already had the albums.
You already
What
bought
can I
it.
tell you? You're absolutely right. I mean, we're going through a period where old business models are being broken. Let's take the phone industry. You know, the idea was you paid a regular subscription, then you paid for calls. You may get it free locally, but if you paid long distance. Once you've shoved the satellites up, once you put the fiber optics in, it costs anybody no more to phone Hong Kong than it does Scarborough from downtown Toronto. So you have to change your business model, because nobody's going to say, I'm going to keep paying that excessive amount of money to phone Hong Kong. Same is true of the music industry. The challenge to these industries, where we move from what we charged that had value to free because it's commodified, is to find new ways. Undoubtedly, we have to learn how to capture the value of intellectual property. And that's the challenge to the music industry and the movie industry. But it's not in the ways we've done it in the past.
Just before Mike and Gordon get into this, I want to play the second clip that we have of those two obscured people. Here's how they justify what they do. Roll tape, please, Michael.
I don't see online downloading as stealing, because when you steal something like a car, that means that the person you stole it from doesn't have that car anymore. When I take a copy of a movie, I'm not depriving that from anyone else. Everybody else can watch that movie just as easily as before, but now I've also watched it.
I'd feel worse about buying a pair of Nike shoes or a pair of or some other wage slave produced good. I think that is a little more ethically dubious than downloading.
Mike, he doesn't see it as stealing. Is he kidding himself?
Well, moral judgments aside, no, a lot of people feel that way. I mean, the reality is for young people, it's been easy. I mean, sadly enough, it's young people's fault, right? It's Sean Fanning's fault for inventing Napster back in his dorm room in '98. The reason I find this all fascinating is Alan's right about the business model question. I mean, the reality is that there were 60 million Napster users already signed up, and no one could figure out how to commoditize that. No one could figure out how to turn that into a monetary program to actually generate revenue. Now, the interesting thing from a youth perspective is the reality is that young people still download a ton. The numbers have dropped, but not dramatically, and they're downloading way more dynamic things. Books being one of the ones. The textbook example that was brought up in the piece there is a really good example. We have publishing clients that ask us about this thing. They're very concerned about it. For me, and I think this is the other question, the assumption has always been that everything you downloaded is a replacement of something you would have spent money on. And my question is, what percentage of downloading is stuff that you're only downloading it because it's free? I'm trying it once because I haven't seen it. And the other thing is, who cares if someone downloads an episode of Grey's Anatomy when you can go to the CTV website? Pardon the plug for the competing network. Go to the CTV website and watch it for free anyway.
Do they put commercials in it when you go to the CTV
They
website?
do it in segments, so you have to watch it a segment, and then they give you like a commercial, and then they give you another segment.
Well, there you go. Then that's not really free. Someone's paying for that.
Sort of, but in the end, it takes no time. And the reality is most people, when they're watching it on the computer, they're doing 14 other things at once. You've seen a teenager's computer screen, right?
Yes.
There are 17 windows open
It's
at once.
busy. It's
yeah,
busy.
Yeah.
Gordon.
It's not blame just young people.
Well, okay, hang on a second. Let me hear from Gordon on this. Gordon, what's your view on the justification for all of this freeloading, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think we're running out of rules. I mean, I think we're going through a fairly fascinating period. We've been demonizing Wall Street executives, and rightly so, in the last year or so. And I think we're entering this period of demonizing consumers, and in the way of, say, Shell's interest in regaining craftsmanship and making consumer awareness, and basically kind of trying to guilt trip people into not trying to buy affordable things. Same true with downloading. I mean, business model-wise, it's a period of great disruption. Is that ultimately one of the big issues, I think, for people that are trying to find a way to make a living, such as those of us who sell books, for example, is a lot of discounting is premised upon value destruction, and Walmart wrote the book on this. Is that you come in, you disrupt the market with crazy stuff, crazy cheap or even free stuff, and see who survives. And do that long enough, and a lot of people might not be left standing to actually produce anything. So I mean, I guess I'm neutral when we're talking about free, because I mean, if that's innovation, that's innovation. I'm not gonna change what's gonna happen anyways. But I think we have to think about where it's going. And for example, if books suddenly went all ebook, no authors got paid, I couldn't write books. I mean, that wouldn't happen. So value destruction's a big issue in the future.
Jesse.
Well, first of all, the idea that Canadian authors make a living by selling books is ridiculous to begin with.
Well, thank you.
And it provides, well, you know many authors, and you know as well as I do that they make a fraction of their money off of a bestseller in Canada is 5,000 books. Authors make money in Canada by the reputations that they create with their books. They get bursaries and grants, they do residencies, they teach, they speak. And if you gave any author today the option between selling 100 books or giving away 100,000 to people who would actually read it, the author would have to be crazy to take the 100 books. I think that, you know, the idea that we are going to have less people creating things because we're giving them away for free has been totally disproven by this point.
Well, someone's got to fund it. I mean, you can in advance. I have to travel. If I want to do journalism, you got to go somewhere.
Well, in the last,
unfortunately, airlines still charge for these things. So I mean, I hate to sound like a fogey, but I mean there are some sort of upfront issues with providing books completely for free. I mean, in the book world, I think it's been a bit of a gimmick so far. I think it's an interesting tactic, but I mean, ultimately, real-time costs do prevail.
Okay, let me hear Alan and then Matthew on this.
That's the challenge, though, isn't it? I mean, let's not blame the kids for downloading everything, because they're going to tell you there are a lot of 40 and 50-year-olds downloading free information off the internet and not paying for their subscriptions to certain newspapers.
Right.
So we've been doing that for a long time. The challenge to the newspaper industry, the information industry, all the industries we talked about, is how do you monetize that information?
But there is a difference here, isn't there, Alan? The newspapers, the major papers, put their stuff online, and they expect you to take it for free.
Yes.
That's not the case with the recording industry or the records industry or the movie industry,
That's true.
which doesn't want you stealing their stuff for free.
Absolutely. But what it requires is exactly as some of the newspapers and news organizations are doing. You make that content available in places where people are prepared to spend money. And going to a movie theater and asking people to pay money to go and sit in one place, so using movies as an example, isn't the way they're going to monetize that creativity.
Okay, Matthew, then Mike.
I totally agree with Mike's point about how much we download that we wouldn't have paid for otherwise. I think what we've seen over the past 10 years is a huge explosion in the market for music, for movies, for books even. People who wouldn't have bought these books, who wouldn't have bought these CDs, are exposed to hundreds of thousands of songs and movies that they wouldn't have otherwise paid for. And so what we have is a crisis of innovation. Rather, in the past 10 years, we've seen the free pirated market innovate time and time again, from Napster to BitTorrent to everything. And we've watched the entrenched, the music industry, the movie industry, not innovate at all. So I think that's a serious challenge to the idea that cheap, free stifles innovation.
Mike.
I think the movie industry is trying to catch up, and they're doing it in different ways, though. I think we underestimate the 3D movie experience, the Avatar, that movie that James Cameron's putting out. We could see some true innovation that makes you have to see the movie in the theater. Yeah. I don't know if you've seen a 3D movie this year, but it's just a much better experience in a lot of ways. But the second thing is the point that Jessica was making about creativity. I don't really worry about creativity. In our research, we've seen an explosion of artists. We've seen an explosion of art galleries and displays, people turning their living rooms into galleries. But my favorite thing is that the cheap effect has an effect on the development of tools to create art. That is to say, if I want to record with my whole band and do it all in one place, the software might cost you $500 at most. It probably costs you less, probably costs you $200. And all you do is you plug your equipment in and manage it all that way. You get the chance to record and produce. It's something that used to take $10,000 to make, now takes a few $100s to make, and suddenly you've got your EP out on CD.
Well, I don't think anybody's arguing there are no benefits to any of this, but Jesse, I still think you need to give Gordon an answer on this. The program you do, call it a program, it is designed to be a free giveaway. You register online, you get it for nothing. We don't expect you to pay for it. You're not stealing it. We want you to take it for nothing. You do that kind of content, search engine,
yes,
on TVO's website. He doesn't. He actually, as he says, has to go places. He has to interview people. He needs to expend money for which he needs some kind of return, otherwise he's out of business, and why would he do it? Speak to him. I mean, where is the economics in all of that?
Well, I'd love to, and there's no argument I could give that will speak louder than the proof of the situation, which is as CD sales have been destroyed over the past 10 years, there has been nothing but an explosion in the amount of music created. That as Hollywood has suffered, more and more people are making, it's a great point Mike made, the tools are getting easier, more and more people are making movies than ever before.
Making, yes, but is anybody getting paid for it?
If the point is the contributions to the culture, that isn't slowing down at all. And I really want to make that point very strongly because we are focusing today on everything that we're losing via free.
No, but that's not the point. Forgive me, that's not the point I'm asking you about. Not yes, whether or not there's culture being made. Of course there is. The question is, how do you monetize it? How do you get people to be paid for it?
Right. So in the case of, say, the author Cory Doctorow, who blogs at Boing Boing, he's been experimenting with this for some time and giving away his books and seeing what's happening. He's conducting an experiment right now to see if selling his ebooks and all the tangential benefits that come from having his books spread. I mean, Canadian authors don't always have the luxury of having their books available in every country in the world. He makes his books available through a Creative Commons license. The copyright is open. People are free to translate his books into foreign languages, and they do. They're free to make comic books and movie adaptations of his books, and they do. As a result, he is much more famous than a Canadian-based sci-fi author usually is. He is doing quite well. He became a New York Times bestselling author. He still had books in the bookstores. With his most recent book, he's just giving it away, selling it online, and also giving it away, and also using donations. Everything at his disposal. And essentially, it is not the burden of these new technologies to somehow bail out obsolete models. Those models grew up around technological circumstances. The physical artifact of the record is just, it was just the best way to do it at the time.
I got a minute left, and I want to give 30 seconds to Alan, and I want to give 30 seconds to Matthew. Matthew, under what circumstances would you actually pay for music, films, or other media you currently get for nothing?
Well, the assumption that any of us young people is going 100% one way or the other, I think, is wrong. I pay for music all the time. It's just a question of the quality. Is it available for free at a better quality, more portable? Is it available for money in that format? And if wherever the best quality is within reason of price, that's what we'll pay for it.
That's where you're going.
I think it's a.
Okay, Alan, let me save some time for Alan. Go ahead.
Books, movies, CDs are ways of communication. We're talking about changing the basic communication. So how do you make money instead of writing a book? Well, firstly, you ask people whether they want to download it for free. If they really like the book, we'll send you and you can pay for a physical copy. You make it by speeches. You make it by, you've got to, this is communication. The technology of those three we've mentioned are technologies of a point in time. It doesn't stop the communication. We've got to find other ways to deliver it.
And that's the last word tonight. Totally free of charge, I might add, as well. Can I thank our out-of-town guests first? Matthew Sears in Hong Kong, Gordon Laird in Calgary, Alberta. Appreciate you being there on the line for us, Gordon. We look forward to your book next month, The Price of a Bargain. And here in studio, Jesse Brown in the middle, flanked by Mike DeBramo and Alan Middleton. Thanks to the three of you for coming in as well tonight.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Now, for more information about tonight's guests and interviews with digital downloaders, please visit us online at tvo.org/theagenda. Tonight's debate was produced by Wojtek Schemberg and Yasmina Sakat. And you can read Wojtek's post called What Supply and Demand Says About Us. You'll find that on our Inside Agenda Producers blog, also on our website at tvo.org/theagenda.